So I've done a video about, the greatest draft steals of all time, the greatest draft bust of all time, the greatest single team drafts in NFL history. So I figured why not follow that up with a video about the 10 greatest NFL drafts as a whole of all time. And that's what I'm doing here. Now, keep in mind that I'm going from 1936 to 2004. The reason I'm stopping at 2004 is because I feel like you need at least a full decade to truly, fully get a proper perspective on the success or failure of that NFL draft class as a whole. You might, after a couple of seasons, be able to look back and say, that was a strong class and that was a weak class. But you need, to me, about a decade to fully piece everything together and fully grade everything out and see how it plays out. So what I've done here is I've compiled a list to me, are the 10 greatest total NFL drafts of all time. Now, I give a lot of preference here to Hall of Famers in a draft and all pros and what have you. A couple of these classes, it's not just about the Hall of Famers that they have already, it's about the Hall of Famers that they probably will have down the road that adds to the strength and depth of that draft class. So here we go, the 10 greatest NFL drafts of all time. Excuse me, let's get started. Number 10, 1968. That class had a total of 7, and I count that again, 7 Hall of Famers, from Ron Yary to Claude Humphrey, Larry Zonka, Curly Culp, Charlie Sanders, Elvin Bethea, and Art Shell. A total of 7 Hall of Famers. That's a pretty damn good draft class. And think about it this way. That's number 10. And you'll notice a theme here. There are a couple of drafts from the 1950s and a few drafts from the 1960s that comprise a big portion of this list, actually. Very surprising to me, actually. No representation from the 1930s, no representation from the 40s or the 70s or the 2000s. And that surprised me a little bit as I went back through and really pieced this list together. Number 9, talking about that decade of the 50s, the 1953 Hall of Fame class had Doug Atkins and Johnson and Bob St. Clair and Stan Jones and Jim Ringo and Schmidt, the great linebacker from Detroit, and Roosevelt Brown. 7 Hall of Famers as part of one class. And when you ask, why did I put 1953 over 1968? I probably look at the guys like the Bob St. Clairs and the Roosevelt Browns and the Joe Schmidts and the Doug Atkins, and I grade them as better players as a collection than what the 68 class had, which is why at number 8 I have the 1952 NFL Draft. Again, another class with 7 Hall of Famers. You have Les Richter and Ollie Matson and Hugh McElhaney and Frank Gifford and Gino Marchetti, Gino the Giant, Yale Larry, and then an undrafted player that was the actual 7th Hall of Famer out of this class, and that was the famous Dick Night Train Lane. Think about that, a total of 7 Hall of Famers. And again, why did I put this class above the class the year after? Because you look at the guys, again, like the Night Train Lanes and the Gino Marchettis and the Frank Giffords and the Hugh McElhaney's and the Yale Larrys, and I think they're better than the 7 Hall of Famers from 53 or 68. Number 7, we go move on to the 1960s and take a look at the 1961 NFL Draft with a total of 7 Hall of Famers, with such legends as Mike Ditka, Dakoch, think about that, Dakoch, excuse me, Jimmy Johnson and Bob Lilly and Herb Adderley and Fran Tarkenton, and Billy Shaw, and a 14th round selection that went by the name of David Jones. You might know him as Deacon Jones. So when you look at this class with 7 Hall of Famers, guys like Ditka, guys like Lilly and Adderley and Tarkenton or Deacon Jones, 5 of what you could argue would maybe be the 100 greatest players in the history of the National Football League. That's why 1961 gets the nod over 52, 53, and 68. Number 6, this might be a bit of a surprise to you, but this was a really strong draft class, and I don't think it gets the recognition that it deserves. One team gets recognition for their performance that year, but the 1996 draft actually had a really good class. You already have one guy in the Hall of Fame in Jonathan Ogden, you're going to have at least a few more guys in there from that class. Marvin Harrison's going to be a Hall of Famer. Ray Lewis will easily be a first ballot, Hall of Famer. I'd assume Brian Dawkins at some point in time will find his way to Canton. Terrell Owens will find his way to Canton someday. Zach Thomas, who was a 5th round pick in that draft, will probably someday, even if it's years down the road, find his way to Canton. A guy like an undrafted kicker like Adam Vinatieri will at some point in time gain induction into the Hall of Fame because of all the success he had as a kicker in clutch moments in the postseason over the years. And I'll even throw another kind of sleeper candidate in there as a Hall of Fame consideration for years down the road, and that's Leroy Glover. People forget just how good of a defensive lineman he was for many years. And you look at this class, you say they have one Hall of Famer now. You could say Marvin Harrison, Ray Lewis are slam dunks. Brian Dawkins, Terrell Owens, Vinatieri all probably get in. Again, you're looking at this class and you're sitting there saying to yourself, man, this is pretty damn good. You're looking at a total of anywhere between 6 to potentially even 8 Hall of Famers. You throw in Zach Thomas and Leroy Glover, like I said. Number 5, the 1967 NFL Draft, which had a total of 8 Hall of Famers. Think about that. 8 Hall of Famers in one draft. That's Bob Griese and Floyd Little and Alan Page and Gene Upshaw and Lem Barney, Willie Lanier, Rayfield Wright, and Ken Houston. A total of 8 Hall of Famers in one draft. And that class is number 5 on the list. Number 5. I could sit there and talk about 1 or 2 of those guys in that draft and talk about whether or not they truly belong in the Hall of Fame. Bob Griese. But at the end of the day, they got induction. Somebody thought they were Hall of Fame worthy, so it's another feather in the cap of the 1967 draft. Number 4, the 1981 draft, another really good draft that I think flies under the radar over the years. A lot of people talk about that 1981 draft because Lawrence Taylor was taken 2nd overall. A lot of people forget who was taken a few picks later, a safety out of USC named Ronnie Lott, who was a cornerstone for that great 49ers dynasty defense of the 1980s. You had other Hall of Famers in that draft too, like Mike Singletary and Howie Long and Ricky Jackson and Russ Grimm. 5 of the 6 players on this list were part of Super Bowl champions in the 1980s. And even a guy you look at like a Ricky Jackson, he was a key part of that Saints defense under Jim Moore in the 80s, really turning the fortunes of the New Orleans Saints franchise around. And the strength of that 81 draft is not just in the guys that are already in the Hall of Fame. There are, to me, a few other possibilities as Hall of Famers down the road, including a few guys that were undrafted. Now, I'm not talking about Deron Cherry. He's a guy that some people will argue belongs in the Pro Football Hall of Fame, and he may someday get that. But you look at undrafted players like Jay Hilgenberg, a 7-time Pro Bowler and All-Pro for the Chicago Bears, a part of that great offensive line that blocked for Walter Payton at the end of his career in the 1980s in Chicago. Looking at Sam Mills, a guy that I think it's a crime isn't already in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Always an underrated player, and you talk about his time in the USFL, what have you. It's supposed to be a Pro Football Hall of Fame, not necessarily just an NFL Hall of Fame, if you get what I'm saying. And then you look at a guy like Joe Jacoby, another guy that kind of flies under the radar that was a part of that great Hogs offensive line of the 1980s that helped the Washington Redskins win 3 world championships in an 11-year stretch. So you're talking about 6 guys already in the Hall of Fame and maybe 2, 3, or even 4 guys that will eventually someday find their way into Canton. That's an impressive class. Number 3, the legendary class of 1957. Let's run down the Hall of Famers here, a total of 9 of them. 9 Hall of Famers in one class. The number 1 overall pick, Paul Hornung. Another guy went a few picks later by the name of Len Dawson. Yeah, he was chosen by the Pittsburgh Steelers, but he eventually went on to lead the Kansas City Chiefs in the 1960s, lead them to AFL titles, lead them to a Super Bowl victory in Super Bowl IV. Jim Brown was the 6th overall pick. Jim Parker, one of the great left tackles of all time. Tommy McDonald, a wide receiver out of Oklahoma, played on those great Bud Wilkinson teams of the 50s. A guy like Sonny Jurgensen, who was a part of a championship team in 1960, backing up Norm Van Brocklin in Philadelphia. Henry Jordan, a guy who was drafted by the Browns that went on to become a Hall of Famer for those great Lombardi Packer teams of the 1960s. Gene Hickerson, who joined Jim Brown in Cleveland as another Hall of Famer, a part of that 64 championship team. Don Maynard, the wide receiver, who would go on to fame as Joe Namath's preferred target for the New York Jets during their time in the AFL and in the early portion of their time in the NFL. All the players that I mentioned, all 9 of these Hall of Famers, were part of at least one championship team. And you're talking about guys, again, like Jim Brown and Jim Parker, Sonny Jurgensen, Don Maynard, Len Dawson, not just really good players, but really, really great players. This is only the number 3 class, so that's what's freaky about it. Number 2, the class that most often is referred to as the greatest draft class of all time, and I think that's in part because it's always remembered as one of those truly iconic, memorable drafts because of the quarterbacks that went in the first round, a total of 6 of them, and I'm, of course, talking about the 1983 draft, and this was a great draft. This is a legendary all-time draft. You had a total of 7 Hall of Famers as it stands right now, including 6 Hall of Famers taken in round 1. A total of 6. 3 of them being quarterbacks. Think about that for a second. 7 Hall of Famers, 6 of them taken in round 1. 3 of them being quarterbacks. You're talking about the first 2 picks in the draft, John Elway out of Stanford, Hall of Famer. Eric Dickerson, number 2 out of SMU, Hall of Famer. Bruce Matthews going 9 to the Oilers, Hall of Famer. Jim Kelly going to the Bills, Hall of Famer. Dan Marino being one of the great draft steals of all time, Hall of Famer. Darrell Green, the pick after him, the last pick of round 1, Hall of Famer. And then an 8th round pick out of Little Tennessee State by the name of Richard Dent, Hall of Famer. A total of 7 guys who have already gained enshrinement into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. 3 really iconic quarterbacks of the 80s and 90s in the National Football League in Elway, Marino, and Jim Kelly that were part of very good organizations and very good teams during their time. And then you talk about other guys too, like Roger Craig and Chris Hinton, 2 other guys that may someday find their way into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. I think Roger Craig might get there first, but Chris Hinton, the funny thing about him was he was the player that was part of the package that saw Denver be able to acquire John Elway in that 83 draft. Now, and again, you're talking about a draft with 7 Hall of Famers, a couple more guys that could potentially get in there. And the biggest key to me and why this belongs at number 2 on the list is because in all 12 rounds of the draft, there was at least 1 Pro Bowler out of each of those 12 rounds. Absolutely incredible. But to me, the greatest draft of all time has to be the 1964 NFL draft. Now, this was at the peak time of the war between the AFL and the NFL. And you had both the NFL and the AFL in a bidding war for talent. Each league ran their own drafts, and as a result, you had this big competition, this big bidding war for talent. Who's going to take who? Who's going to take who? And this is like the ultimate coup at the time for the National Football League. There were 10 Hall of Famers that were drafted. All 10 of them were drafted by and played for National Football League teams. This was really a key moment in turning the favor in the NFL's way as opposed to the AFL way, and nobody ever really talks about that, frankly. A total of 10 Hall of Famers in this class. 10 of them. Just think about that for a second. You had guys, again, we're talking about 10 Hall of Famers. The guys like the Charlie Taylors and the Carl Ellers, the Paul Warfields, the Mel Renfros, the Bullet Bob Hayeses, the Roger Staubachs, the Dave Wilcoxes. Just think about that. Leroy Kelly, did I mention him? Yeah, part of that great Brown 64 draft class with Paul Warfield. And you look at this, several of these players were a part of championship teams, and 10 of them in one draft when the NFL was in this great war with the AFL, and they got all 10 of these guys to play their careers in the NFL as opposed to going over to the AFL. And that's, to me, what makes the 1964 draft, because it has the most Hall of Famers of any class of all time, 10. It was done at a time where there was this great bidding war for talent. You had competing drafts between the NFL and the AFL. The NFL found 10 Hall of Famers and kept them all to themselves, and the AFL didn't get a damn one from 1964. When you take a look at that, the number of Hall of Famers, the number of championships that these guys, or great teams that these guys were all parts of during their careers, I think that's what gives the edge to 64 over maybe the class of 83 and 57. I really think, frankly, that numbers 1, 2, and 3 are interchangeable because they are that close. I mean, you might look at 57 with having Jim Brown and a couple of those other guys and say, him and Jim Parker, that puts that class over the top. You could say the 83 class with 3 Hall of Fame quarterbacks, including 2 all-time great quarterbacks like Elway and Marino, and you could sit there and say, maybe that class deserves to be number 1. But like I said, from my preferences and based off of my grading system, the greatest NFL draft of all time was the one of 1964. Let me know what you think about my all-time list down in the comments section down below. Hope you agree with it. I'd like to see you dispute it, though, if you could.